Flowing north from its most southerly source in Lake Victoria, the Nile is a great artery, supporting the lives and livelihoods of some 180 million people. Roughly 1/3 of the entire population of the African continent lives in the Nile River basin. Uganda is just one of 10 countries that depend on the waters of the river basin. But climate change means that this environment, which has sustained people for thousands of years, is changing.
The river, it's where the poor people get water for drinking, for cooking, for washing, for building houses. Secondly, it is this river where people get fish. And if fish disappears, then the livelihoods of the poor people will be affected. Some of these people use water for irrigation, like in Egypt, like in Sudan, and even in Uganda. And if that water is no longer there, then people will suffer.
Today's lunch, we have fish, dry fish, and posho, millet, cassava flour. So sweet, enjoyable. So you eat, you eat. Why not eating? The extra fish we catch, part of it we sell, part of it we dry and we keep it because we don't have fridge. That's why we always dry them. We use sunshine and salt in it. They cook the fish. This fish they always cook like this. This dry fish, we just set fire and we put cold water into the pot, pour water in it. After pouring water, we just put our dry fish in it without any cooking oil, onions and the rest. This fish very in the morning, I always go to the river Nile.
Have you heard much about climate change?
The climate change? I never heard of that.
Elliot lives in a mud hut on the edges of society, so it is not extraordinary that he and his family know nothing about climate change. But elsewhere in Uganda, there are communities that are better informed, because climate change is already affecting their lives.
I'm on my way up Mt Elgon to interview Wagoire William, the director of Buginyanya Agricultural Institute. The roads are rough. I had to stop many times for the direction, but I know we'll get there.
Mt Elgon rises to over 2,000 metres and lies to the east of Uganda, on the border with Kenya. William has come here to find out more about climate change from local communities and how it is affecting Uganda's main cash crop, coffee. The coffee business is crucial to this developing economy, supporting hundreds of people in local communities. But the Arabica coffee that thrives in the cool highlands of Mt Elgon is under threat from rising global temperatures. This changing climate brings with it an increase in pests and disease.
The effect of climate on agriculture is incredibly complex, because you have on one side, especially in some areas, a beneficial effect of increased temperatures, which means an increase in the length of the growing season. On the other side, you have some critical threshold that can be exceeded. And depending on the plants, different plants have different crops have different critical threshold. But if you exceed that critical threshold, just the plant just dies.
Here we are in a coffee chamber, and here you can have a look at how beautiful a well-managed coffee field looks like. These are the coffee berries ready for picking. When all of them are ripe to this extent, this is a farmer's pride. When he looks at this, he knows he's out of the poverty line. Actually, this is a beautiful picture of This is a beautiful example of leaf rust. You can see it attacks also on the underside of the leaf, and you see how, do you call that yellow or whatever it is, orange? Yeah. So the whole leaf is going to be covered with that, and with that coloration, there's no way the plant can photosynthesize to make food for the plant.
Further down the mountain the next day, William has an appointment with a retired diplomat, Wimimbi Wayasa, who now grows trees and farms a small holding.
Mr. Wimimbi, how long have you been in this place?
I've been here for the last 40 years.
Have you noticed any effects of climate change over the past few years?
Very much so, Mr. Odinga. In this part where you are seated in Masabaland, here in Busano, there were no mosquitoes during my younger days, until about 70s or 80s when the mosquitoes came here. All this sub-county was mosquito-free. But because of the high temperatures, mosquitoes have invaded us. Of course, with the invasion of mosquitoes, there are a lot of malaria cases these days, even more than those areas where mosquitoes were prevalent in those days. Okay, so the banana wilt is on with us, but we are trying to eradicate it. So William, the signs of this banana bacterial wilt begin like this, with yellow leaves. So the wilt might have been there, but the change, the climate change, might have been a quickening process of increasing this disease. So it has also affected the economy of this area of Uganda. And I'm planting new ones, and I can see a positive change.
But while communities in Uganda have already begun to experience climate change, understanding more about the potential long-term effects for the Nile is another issue.
I mean, it's always difficult to make a prediction on long-term climate change, because the only way we can do it is to prescribe the concentration of greenhouse gases into a global circulation model, so a model describing the global climate, and see how this model describes the average climate in a few years' time. And for certain part of the globe, different models, so models developed by different scientific communities, agrees on the trend. Like on the Mediterranean, we know that especially during the summer, it's going to be drier and hotter. And so you're quite confident that, for instance, on the higher part of the Nile, close to the delta, it's going to be much drier during the summer and much warmer. If you go farther south, actually different models predict different situations, and you are not that certain of what's going to happen.
But new evidence from a research project in Ethiopia may provide climate scientists with a better understanding of the Nile's future.
Well, we've been working in Ethiopia for some years looking at smaller lakes. We realised that nobody had worked on Lake Tana, despite the fact that it's the source of one of the most important rivers in the world, the Blue Nile. Initially, we got some funding to look at the idea that there'd been a drought 4,200 years ago that caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt. And since the Ethiopian highlands are the source of the water that feeds Egypt, it makes a lot of sense to go to the source of the Blue Nile, to Lake Tana, and see if we can find geological evidence for that event. Well, when we did our coring, we chose the deepest part of the lake, 12 meters, 14 meters deep, and almost the last core contained a very dramatic brown peaty sediment, the sort of peat you get out of a bog here. And a bog, of course, is a terrestrial material. It's not the kind of material you find in a lake. So we pulled this core out and thought, my goodness, here we are in business. This must mean a dramatic lowering of lake level. It must mean the lake dried out in the past. We thought that was going to be the 4,200-year event. But when we got it back to the lab, it's much older. It's 16,000 years old. Here's the clay layer, the stiff clay, which represents the dried out lake surface at about 16,000 years ago. And from here up is the dark material, a very dark peaty material, which is deposited in a swamp, a papyrus swamp. That peaty sample represents the interval of the lake beginning to fill up after probably a major drought event about 16,000 years ago. A drought event which affected pretty much all of Africa and is connected to what was going on in the Atlantic. We think that the ice sheet in the North Atlantic collapsed at that time, sending an armada of icebergs and meltwater across the Atlantic Ocean, warming up the oceans and reducing the temperature pressure contrast that drives the monsoon. So the monsoon broke down and the rains failed, probably for a couple of hundred years or more. Putting together the geological evidence that we have from Lake Tana at the source of the Blue Nile, and also the earlier evidence from Lake Victoria and Lake Albert at the source of the White Nile, the evidence is that all of those lakes dried up some 16,000 years ago, stayed dry or filled up gradually until they overflowed at 14,700 years ago. So we can make this dramatic statement that for that period of time, the Nile itself was effectively dry. It had dried to a trickle. Well, the concern is that with climate changing as rapidly as it is now, with global warming, the Greenland ice sheet may behave in the same way. In fact, there's good evidence that the Greenland ice sheet is beginning to move rapidly and perhaps collapse within the next few decades. And if that happens, it would undoubtedly lead to a flood of fresh water into the North Atlantic and might well affect this current flows through the North Atlantic and eventually the African monsoon too.
Back on the Nile at Jinja in Uganda, Elliot's main concern is a hole in his fishing boat.
This boat got some problem when we were trying to fish somewhere that way, and we knocked a certain stone inside the water. That's why we got a bit of a small accident anyway.
And is it going to take long for you to fix it?
This will not take long. After a short time, we shall go in. Yes, our boat's fantastic. It's very strong now. We can make it.
While Elliot fixes his boat to prepare himself for another day's fishing, the big question is, if the Nile has run dry before for 1,300 years, as Henry Lamb's research in Lake Tana suggests, could it run dry again? And might this process have already started?
In 2006 and part of 2007, we had low water levels here. And all this vast area that you are seeing here was laid bare. At the bottom here, you find nests of tilapia. These nests are the ones which are built by male tilapia, and they are used as by females to deposit their eggs and for the eggs to get fertilized. If this is laid bare, then that means this activity, this very, very important breeding activity, cannot take place, and definitely that one will affect the stocks of that fish species and the communities of people who depend upon it.
According to recent reports from Sudan, in the last year the Nile has been at one of its lowest levels for nearly a century.
What we're concerned about is potentially rapid and extreme changes occurring in the future because of global climate change. There is scientific evidence from lake cores and from environmental reconstructions that these parts of the world have seen humid periods, so it's been much wetter than it is now, but they've also seen much drier periods. And during those times, what we see is rivers drying up, lakes drying out, and massive environmental changes over quite fast periods of time. We now have very different circumstances. There are millions more people living in the region, and their livelihoods and the national economies are very dependent on the availability of water and the ability to be able to grow crops. So if changes occur over the next 10, 20, 30 years in the future, then they will have absolutely dramatic consequences.
Tomorrow morning, I'll be going for fishing. I've already completed repairing my boat, and the boat's now very strong. I shall be able to at least to catch something from the river Nile, where we always survive from.
And then maybe in the evening, I will be going for some leisure time. Take a bit of booze somewhere, our marble, that end. This is what I will do.